Welcome to the Digital Amateur Television Experimenters Night. This is VK7 OTC, the club station of the Radio and Electronics Association of Southern Tasmania. Amateur radio is a worldwide hobby that has many different aspects. Digital television is just one of the many modes and areas that are covered. Maybe you're interested in becoming involved in the DATV Experimenters Nights. Do you realise that you do not have to be a radio amateur or need any ATV equipment to participate anywhere in the world? Also participate in the night by coming up to the Queen's Domain club rooms. Yes, right on top of the Queen's Domain in the heritage-listed Coast Wireless Station. You never know, we might get you in front of the camera or behind doing one of the many roles during the night. We get underway with our program on a Wednesday night from 7:30 p.m. local time. We'll see you soon. This is VK7 OTC.
And good evening, this is VK7 OTC, the club station of the Radio and Electronics Association of Southern Tasmania with our DATV Experimenters Night. And we'll get underway with our Acknowledgement of Country. In recognition of the deep history and culture of this island, we would like to acknowledge and pay our respects to all Tasmanian Aboriginal people, the traditional owners of the land upon which we meet tonight. And VK7 Tango Whiskey Justin at the mic tonight. And thanks to Andrew from down at Signet for calling in. If you are watching, please let us know where you're coming in from, and a name always helps. Yeah, and I just mentioned to Andrew lots and lots of media releases out of the Pawsey Supercomputing Centre, which is where Andrew works. So about some great stuff going on with the square kilometre array and the processing to go with that. So good stuff, and look forward to more information about that particular project. So really good. So please let us know where you're coming in from. Also, we're listening on R2. And tonight we're focusing on the second part of the WIA there we go response to the ACMA consultation on the class license and higher power operation. And tonight what we're doing is actually focusing on the second bit of the consultation response, which is the higher power side of what the ACMA was asking for some feedback on. And it is a complex picture. It's a historical and a complex picture. So we'll take you through the elements that were in the consultation. But firstly, I'll just do a very quick recap of what I covered last week. The class license. So the WIA is now cautiously agreeing to the class license. There are some areas of concern that have been put forward in the consultation response that are not major issues, but they are areas of concern that we would like the ACMA to consider But the WIA is now supporting the move to a class license. So that's one plus. And the second part of what the ACMA asked about was the higher power. How do we address the higher power elements? And there has been, as people will certainly know if you've been in amateur radio for a little while in Australia, there was a fairly controversial trial, high power trial a little while ago. Probably didn't go as well as it could. And the ACMA has been sort of pointing back to that and going, well, what's changed? And so the WIA and the Spectrum Strategy Committee, of which I'm a part, put together what we think is a fairly well considered response to try and address the concerns that the ACMA had around this area, and that's what we're going to go through tonight. So, without further ado, okay, so covering higher power operation. Now, the very first thing here, which we wanted to acknowledge that the historical approach and the history behind the higher power and the trial and a whole lot of other bits and pieces, because there are quite a number of amateurs who are running high power. They have gone through the EMR and the EMR assessment, and they've been granted high power permits. And so there are quite a number of those people who, one of the things we don't want to happen is for them to lose that agency that they've already got, because they're actually the leaders in this space, and we don't want them to lose what they've already got. So there's a little bit around here, a recommendation and around continuity and grandfathering existing permits, and continue to accept new applications under the existing arrangements. Word from our sponsor. And so just to ensure that those people are not disadvantaged at this point in time. So that's where we start. Now, we came up with a range of principles, I suppose you'd say, which we want to actually, which we're presenting to the ACMA. The one thing here is what we're trying to get the ACMA to recognise is that the amateur service is a little bit unique in its nature, given that it's actually specified in the ITU radio regulations number 25 and other bits and pieces. So there aren't too many things which are actually in writing in the radio regulations, but the amateur service and what the amateur service actually does is one of those things. We are universally technically qualified. So one of okay, now I'll say here what we're talking about here is AOCPA, so advanced licenses. They are the only licenses that we are talking about as part of the submission that the WIA made. So it is only advanced licensees that we're talking about as part of this this particular response. So just with that in the back of your mind, those people who have passed their amateur operator certificate of proficiency advanced is the cohort that we're talking about here. So amateur operators are usually universally technically qualified, and so the objectives that we want to use in presenting these suggestions are there are three of them. So amateurs have gained well-managed and safe access to higher power as part of standard conditions in amateur class licenses, as is the case in New Zealand. Now New Zealand, and I'll show you the comparison we did with power levels around the world. New Zealand currently have access to a kilowatt. And we're basing a lot of the things that we're putting in this consultation around the New Zealand conditions and their access to that higher power. We understand that there needs to be a phased approach, a staged approach, so it gives the ACMA the confidence to implement this and implement this more widely. And it's important that in approaching this matter, we need to support, train Australian radio amateurs so that it also gives the ACMA the confidence that those amateurs who are operating high power actually know what the standards are, what the thresholds are, what the safety issues are, what the interference issues are, etc., 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 and be able to assess their station. They're the principles that we've put that sort of underpin this particular response. Now, we went out with a survey. We had about 615 people come back, and as part of the survey, there were lots of questions around the high power access. We asked, one of those questions was, what would you want to use higher power for? And we split it into two areas. So below 30 megs, so we're talking HF, and above 30 megs, so VHF and above. And it was interesting that we came back, the vast majority of responses was for HF intercontinental communication, namely DXing, which was a bit of a surprise to a number of members on the committee, because we honestly thought it was going to be sort of more technical, moon bounce, celestial bodies, meteor scatter, etc., etc., etc. So they certainly get HF radio sports and contesting's the next one on the list. Regular HF scheduled communications, quite high, and then we move into the above 30 megs into moon bounce, meteor scatter, 50 meg intercontinental communications. And can I just say, I did have a whisper decode yesterday from the States on 6 meters, which was I was pretty impressed about. And then there are a number of other uses or activities that that people responded to as part of the survey. So, big interest in HF intercontinental communications, namely DXing. And we go into this in a bit more detail in a few slides' time. So that's the chart of what I just showed you. So really lots of responses around intercontinental communications, radio sport and contesting, and regular communications. So which is exactly what is in the ITU radio regulations number 25 around what the amateur service actually does. So the top three are supporting amateur radio and the radio regulations. So now in the HF versus VHF and VHFI celestial bodies, you can see vast majority of the responses are for HF use of high power. Now, why is the majority of interest in high power on HF? And there's some interesting charts here which show if you have the DX station that you're contacting, say, and in this particular example in Europe, and you have 400 watts that you're able to transmit on, and that red line that cuts across the chart is Europe's noise floor. If you're running 400 watts, you are in good conditions, only just on their noise floor, versus if you're running higher power, which the other columns are, you'd be up above their noise floor. If you are running 1,000 watts, so it shows that you are reasonably above, a fair bit above the noise floor in the current average noise floor in Europe. So this is why we think it is literally to get above, get a bit of an advantage, because there are many other countries which I'll show in a sec who are running up in the 1,000 watts and more, and are able to contact because they are punching above the noise floor, which is ever increasing, unfortunately. So, I'll just go back a step. Now, consider reciprocity with other countries and power limits. So, in Canada, 2.25 kilowatts Baltic states, down to Brazil, 2 kilowatts, USA 1.5, New Zealand's 1, Norway, South Africa, all 1, Fiji 1. So New Zealand and Fiji, they're probably the closest countries to us. And we come down, Germany's 800 watts, UK is 400 watts, like Australia. So very interesting, considering what other countries are able to operate. VHF and UHF use of high power. Now, this is certainly of concern, because as soon as you go up in frequency, the energy level goes up considerably. So this is from a safety perspective. You really need to know what you're doing as soon as you go up to these sort of power levels for VHF and above. So high power moon bounce operation on 6 meters. High average power up to 500 watts is needed for 144 or 2 meter moon bounce and meteor scatter with an up to 16 to 18 dBi antenna gain. High power is advantageous for 6 meters intercontinental and VHF radio sport contesting where 1 kilowatt power is considered desirable, at least on 50 on 6 meters. So VHF and above, slightly different circumstances. So the management of high power in the amateur service. Now this is the 3 dot points here summarise the concerns that the ACMA have put on the table as part of the consultation. 3 key themes, so electromagnetic emission management, so EME management, and the safety of the general public as well as the operator. Electromagnetic interference, EMI, from the amateur transmitter into surrounding equipment, and radio frequency interference into adjacent radio communication services. So these are the 3 areas that our submission addresses, and we go through each of these in quite a bit of detail, which I'm not going to go through. But if you want to have a look at the submission, and I'll put a link to it in the description under this video. But each of these we go through in lots of detail. So just to summarise, EME management principles. So these are the principles that we've put forward to address and hopefully give the ACMA some confidence that these issues are being addressed by the amateur community. Training materials and systems need to be developed to support existing amateurs' self-education, which is part of what we do as amateurs, on how to achieve EME compliance. Methods for practical safety assurance and documentation that are specifically geared towards the amateur radio service, not just generally, and need to be developed. And the processes are outlined in standards. So this is power standards, NZS 2772.2, and the ACMA endorsement for these practices would need to be obtained, obviously. So that shows that they have confidence that we've put in place the framework to address the concerns. Now, when we put forward possible processes for how we actually meet this and how we do this to give the ACMA the confidence that they're requiring, so there were a whole bunch of ways that we could do this. There was a certificate of proficiency approach. So this is like having an AOCP extra, where you do a little bit more study. It has a syllabus associated with it for things that you actually have to learn about safety, about measurement, about interpreting results, etc., etc. So knowing how to measure what an interpretation of what you're measuring, and whether it meets particular safety standards, etc., etc. So that's one approach, and that's the top one. Now you'll notice that got the most responses in the survey. Actually 55% of people said we really need the ability to prove that as an amateur I want to operate high power and I want to meet these requirements. I want to do a little bit more study or whatever to meet these requirements and then sit the exam and be issued a certificate, an AOCPE or whatever they want to call it, that proves that I know what I'm talking about. I know that I can operate safely, and all of the things associated with operating high power. Now, the other options that we put up were self-assessment and management with some restrictions, direct regulatory supervision. So this is the ACMA basically sets all of the requirements. They come out, they assess, they make sure that you've assessed properly, they make sure the safety requirements are being met, etc., etc. And that was 3%, so that was the lowest. And in fact, that's the least preferred by the ACMA because that involves a lot more work by the ACMA. And 7% said, don't want to do any of that, but I want high power. So, which is not going to meet the requirements of convincing and giving the ACMA confidence that the amateur service actually knows what it's doing in relation to high power. So, the biggest one there, 55% of people said, want to do some more study, want to get some sort of recognition that I'm able to understand about operating high power, etc., etc. So, that was an interesting result. So, EME safety assurance, processes and documentation, we advocate, so the WIA advocates that there needs to be the ability to, and a framework around this, to assess a particular site, assess your station, assess your equipment, your antennas, your location, your proximity to people, to etc., etc., within a suitable compliance assessment and management framework. Self-assessment based on approaches using relatively low-cost equipment, like a Radman meter, now a radiation measuring meter, an easy-to-access training, so okay, great, and establishment of suitable documentation standards and storage systems targeting radio amateurs. So, should be sufficient to allow a reliable, demonstrable compliance with our Panzer. Now, one of the things I should say here, in moving to the class license, the ACMA wants to move to the Panzer RPS 2-1, I think it is. Correct me if I'm wrong there, but the Panzer standard, radiation standard. And the WIA supports moving to that standard because it is actually a lot easier to understand and a lot easier to then interpret. And we want the ACMA to actually use that standard and interpret to that standard, not have arbitrary requirements and arbitrary standards of which. We want it actually based in the Panzer standard and also the Australian-New Zealand standard around power measurement. So that's what we've put in the recommendations and advocate for. So a scenario. We actually put a number of scenarios, and there is a fantastic. In fact, if you want to have a look at how the RSGB do this. Have a look. Go to the Ofcom website. There'll be a link on the RSGB website, and I'll put it in the description and the links of the video. But they have a great little tool where you can put in a whole lot of parameters, and it tells you the indicative safety limits, proximity, all of this sort of stuff, and how far away it's got to be, etc., etc. So a great little tool that enables you to actually self-assess your particular arrangement, your particular operating arrangement. So that would be the sort of tool that we're actually looking at. But as an example, this particular example that we put in here, a 1 kilowatt HF station complying with the low risk transmitters regulation currently in force, which is originally this was below 100 watts, in the general apparatus LCD. So if we have an amateur station wishing to use a kilowatt for SSB transmission on 14 megs, so 20 meters, to do so, the station consideration can be summarised as a frequency and power level at 14 megahertz at 1 kilowatt, a modulation factor of 50%, so it's 50% of the time, a TX-RX duty cycle of 50% of the time, so you're transmitting 50% of the time. You've got an antenna gain of about 6.5 dB, which is a typical Yagi antenna, with the antenna mounted more than 10 metres off the ground. So you've got it on the top of a tower, and no buildings are within 10 to 15 metres of the tower higher than a single story. Now, if you do the Arpanza calculations on this, that station would be an average EIRP of 30.4 dBW or 1120 watts. Therefore, it currently easily fits under the definition of the low risk station as proposed in Schedule 1 of the draft class licence, which sets the limit in this scenario of 3200 watts EIRP. So this is not an unusual scenario, and one of the reasons why we put this in. If you have a reasonable sized quarter acre block, you've got a 10 metre tower in the middle of the back of the block, you've got a single story building, you've got your Yagi up above 10 metres, you would actually meet the low risk transmitters requirement that is currently specified. So, let alone actually meeting the Arpanza requirements. So, interesting scenario. And we're thinking along the lines of, in the tool set of tools that you can use to self-assess, there would be a whole lot of these scenarios, common scenarios, that you would find in an amateur's backyard or an amateur's paddock or whatever, and it gives you the ability to say, well, actually that's my scenario, and here's the calculations for whether it meets the Arpanza and the Australian New Zealand standards. So low risk transmitters supporting using high power in some cases. Now there's a whole lot of other factors that need to be taken into account here, which I mentioned some of them just then. There is location, there is position, is there an event, is there something else that we need to actually take into account, and it doesn't matter. The one thing, the point that we actually make in the response is it doesn't matter that perhaps the amateur radio operator is actually engaged in a radio sport activity and wishes to use higher power, because the operation of the station in a radio sport environment is actually, when we look at the ITU radio regulations, a legitimate use of amateur radio, and the act of building or operating that station is always enhancing the operator's education and self-training in the art of using higher power. So it actually meets the requirements of the radio regulations. So we make the point here that WIA does not believe the ACMA should be dictating what type of communications event or activity high power is used for. And so this goes to them wanting to use the scientific license, which just has so many things wrong with it, let alone the actual requirements for a scientific license, which doesn't meet the amateur radio requirements under the radio regulations. Now, okay, moving on. Managing electromagnetic interference. So EMI. Now, this is certainly a concern for the ACMA. Now, considering the current arrangement where we can an advanced operator can operate 400 watts, the proposed 4 to 6 dB increase in power is not expected to result in significant increase in EMI events. And we make the point that EMI events these days are actually managed in most cases by the amateur themselves, and they are the ones who actually self-manage at this point in time. It's quite rare these days to actually get the ACMA involved. So we just make the point that most EMI issues are actually already managed by the amateur community anyway, not the ACMA. So the management of radio frequency interference. So this is the third of those concerns that the ACMA put forward. And this takes the form in stereo emissions and harmonics, Receiver blocking, so overpowering the front end of a receiver, interference between amateur stations, and potential disruption to primary services where amateur radio is actually a secondary service. And there are large sections that cover each of these, and the WIA's response to the ACMA on each of these. Suffice it to say that none of the responses come up with any of these actually being a blocker to running higher power. So that's the bottom line on those. So I'm not going to go into those in any more detail. So the WIA position on managing higher power, and I'm sorry, there's an awful lot in this slide. I'll just go through the key points. So we strongly advocate that any proposed solution that enables the amateur service to access higher power privileges in Australia should provide a pragmatic and practical solution that has broad applicability while maintaining an absolute focus on ensuring public safety and adherence to the necessary standards, which in this case is the APANSA standard and also the Australian New Zealand power level standard. So some of the things that we are recommending is any limitations that are the result of EME emissions should be tied directly to science-based outcomes based on the APANSA standard. So application of that particular standard to any of the arrangements of running high power. Arbitrary additional restrictions should be avoided. So base it on the standards. That management recognise the dynamic nature of amateur radio. So we could be operating portable, we could be operating at home, we could be operating with a whole range of different antennas, etc., etc. So it has to be practical. And we support the need that there needs to be a range of training requirements and training standards developed. So that's why we're suggesting that it's a 1 to 3 year process. Those things get developed, they get tested with a group, and we make sure that the ACMA is comfortable and confident that we're actually addressing their concerns. The self-management is to a high degree already. We just highlight that point. And in practical terms, any concerns regarding increased risks to other communications spectrum users need to be tempered with the understanding that a typical lack of geographic proximity between those services and amateur radio stations. So, and power disparity between licence grades is not seen as an issue within the amateur service, and that came from our survey responses. So there's an awful lot on that page. I suggest if you haven't looked at the response, then please have a look, and I'll put the link in the video. Now, we just make a few comments here around the ACMA's scientific licence approach. It just straight out conflicts. When we unpacked what the scientific licence was actually developed to do and the principles behind it, it actually conflicts with the definition of amateur radio and the amateur service as in the radio regulations. There's also a fairly high scientific licence cost. There's an annual cost of something like about $600 or more. And so the WIA position on use of a scientific licence is just, it doesn't meet, it conflicts, it is a cost burden to the amateur service, and it is not a solution. That's the bottom line. It's not a suitable solution. So what we're suggesting is, what we've put forward in our recommendations, our bunch of recommendations, is an education and training based approach, and that means a little syllabus, something that indicates that you've actually passed it. Conduct a trial in stages over the 3 years. The appropriate power level, lots of debate about this. We've landed on 1 kilowatt, and should all amateurs have access? No. We're actually ACOP. Sorry, that typo. That's my typo. The amateur certificate of proficiency for amateur advanced operators only, and it is all done within a high power licensing framework. That would be included in the class license. So that's what we're recommending. It's all about building confidence for the ACMA, for giving them confidence that we actually, those people who want to run high power, know what they're doing, how to run it safely, and so that is the whole underpinning principle, I suppose you'd say, around what we've put forward in relation to the high power requirements, and it is based on the relevant science base applying the RPSS 1. Sorry, I said RPSS 1. I think it's 1-2 standard. So the relevant standards, base it on that, not arbitrary arrangements. So I think that might be the last slide. Yes, it is. So that was a lot to go through, wasn't it? But anyway, I'll put a link to this particular document. This is a 92-page document, so it's a fairly hefty tome. But you can pick it up and go to particular parts and read through, and it's self-supporting in those particular parts. So I'll put a link to this. Now I'll just outline next week. We will have a DATV night next week. It is the 28th of December next week, and that's our 41st DATV night for 2022, and that'll be our last DATV night for 2022. But we are intending to run all the way through, so we will be here on YouTube streaming and going out on RF as well, and taking calls. Next week we'll go through the latest DUBUS magazine, which literally arrived today. This is the fourth quarter for 2022. Lots of really interesting VHF and above bits and pieces in there. But one of the things I promised, and we'll finish off on this, is a few more interesting Morse keys. For those who don't know, I collect Morse keys. Absolutely love Morse keys. These are an artifact of our existence, and so there are a few interesting Morse keys that I've brought in, which follows on from our focus on European Morse keys a little while ago. So there's just a few little ones here. This one fairly hefty. This is I understand this has actually come off a ship originally. It is manufactured expressly for the Amalgamated Wireless Australasia Limited, so AWA, and it is a transmitting key type number 3658D, I think it is, made in England by MIMC company. If I take the top off, you'll actually see it is beautifully made, because there are bearings, ball bearing races as part of this absolutely huge contacts. So I don't know what this was switching, but I suspect quite a lot of current. And you'll notice with the cover on, there is an insulating plate here, which means that you can't actually get to any bits of metal on the key. So I suspect it was probably switching fairly high voltage and potentially current. There's a whole lot of inductors and transformers here. Very nice feel of a key, and which is what you'd expect with the race, the ball races. AWA key. I have been told that this is a ship's key. It would have been bolted down on the ship, but AWA key came out of the UK. Now this one. This is a fascinating little key. Actually, I'll put this on the close-up camera because there's a wonderful bit of writing that's on the let's go to here and zoom in and focus. Oh, there we go. This is a US Army key, obviously, but one of the things about this key is it's a flame-proof key. So it was obviously being operated in an area where you do not want any sparks or anything, so there was flammable material or explosives or something in there. But this is a J5A flame-proof key. If I zoom out a bit, zoom out a little bit, you'll notice great little key. Everything's inside of here. The two adjustments are over here for the gap and the tension, and it comes out on the side of the key, and you can see. And I actually use this key because it's got the 3.5mm jack on it. So flame-proof key, US Army, US Signal Corps, US Army. So interesting little key on a big bit of Bakelite on the bottom, and you can see they even fill in where there are the connections. They fill it in with resin, so there's no chance that any spark or any material can get into where the contacts are. So a fascinating little key. Now, pretty common key actually. You see these come up on VK Ham every so often, and I think these are actually still available. These are high mound, they're Japanese keys made in Japan, have a huge bit of plate steel on the bottom to give it a bit of weight. Very nice key. It's just the right height so you can stop the you can have your arm resting on the table, and your fingers are at the right height. 2 contacts, strain relief, everything's covered, so no fear of any zapping or whatever. So it's a HK706 high mound made in Tokyo, Japan, and high mound I think still produce these. A range of these. This is the larger one. They've got a range of smaller ones as well. So they're ones you come across every so often. Now this is AWA key. So this is a Morse key, AWA. Now this, the thing that confused me about this is it's got an AWA number on it, which I went, okay, that must be the AWA number. This is a what was commonly referred to as a WT 8 amp. 8 amp number 2 keys. Now there are so many of these around. They were produced not only for light signalling sets, they're for they're on transmitting sets, all sorts of sets, all British and also British, New Zealand, South African. I think South African produced a version of this, and beautiful little key, really nice action. Some nice big terminals on it, and it's got the skirt on the which is really good. I find having a skirt on the actual knob really helps in relaxing your fingers. It's got spring tension and also the gap adjustments. But yeah, a WT 8 amp number 2. I don't know whether the 8 amp actually refers to the fact that the contacts can take 8 amps. They are certainly large contacts under each of these. They're sprung above instead of below, which is on the other keys. The contacts are actually below. They're actually above. So what you're doing is on this one you're breaking the contact. On this one you're actually making the contact. It's coming up and making the contact, which is how you can then have a little adjustment on the top and not have to go in through the bottom, which is a bit of a interesting design technique. So anyway, and the last one I've got here. Now this is a homebrew key. I really like homebrew keys, but this is all made in brass. It has ball bearings, ball races as the that support the shaft. Little hexagonal brass rod here with a knob and a skirt on it. The gap adjustments here, and also the tension is here as well, spring tension, and it comes out to two little contacts here. Now G4ZPH. was the original owner of this particular key. It is all mounted on a piece of marble. So really heavy piece of marble. And that's you want the base to be heavy so it doesn't wander around the desk. You certainly don't want it sliding around. And then there are two little contacts here, all home brewed. I don't know who made it, whether it was G4 ZPY or not, but beautiful little key, great feel, and the ergonomics of it are just right, and really heavy base. So it's not going to go anywhere on the table, and a bit of felt on the bottom. Actually, a bit of the felt that's used in pool tables, I reckon. But anyway, so yeah, that's a few more of my keys. There are a few more that are there, but anyway, that's enough for tonight. It's absolutely fascinating, and as you go around to different countries, they all have different little design techniques and different ways of doing things. So yeah. Now, so we are running through the Christmas and the New Year break, so we will be here next week. I'm hoping to have to show and tell a 15 to 40 meter magnetic loop that I'm in the throes of building right at the moment. I'm silver soldering on the ends to the tube in the next few days, and so I'm hoping that I'll have that. I'm also hoping that I have some results from the 160 meter short ground plane short vertical ground plane experiments that I've been doing. So watch this space. So as well as other stuff, I might even bring in some more Morse keys. In fact, I might bring in really sexy paddles. They are just absolute works of art. Anyway, so that's our show for tonight. And this has been VK7 OTC, the club station of the Radio and Electronics Association of Southern Tasmania, with our DATV Experimenters Night 73. Have a fantastic Christmas, a safe Christmas, and look forward to catching up with you after Christmas and just before we head into 2023. 73, and we will catch you next time. Cheers.